Hey everyone, it's Millie.
It's Gabby.
And welcome back to another week of Change by Degrees. And
was there spooky music in the front? Because Millie said she was going to ask.
We'll see if I actually found something that's fitting.
Okay.
But the spooky music should give you a cue and the title as to what we're going to talk about. And before we start any discussion on the topic for this week, we wanted to give like a trigger warning because it's not something we typically talk about. If you're like a true crime junkie, stay tuned. This is for you.
But
if you're me
not...
from 5 years ago, tune off. You know what I mean? We don't. If you are,
we will be talking about stuff that like murders and stuff like that. Not like tons of gruesome detail, but we do.
It's
talk
not that
about
bad.
It.
There's worse, but
yeah, there's definitely worse. But just be
if
wary.
you're a paranoid person, if you're not feeling yourself right now, maybe tune back in in the next few days. But so hopefully you just log off. We will see you next week if so. But if not,
the rest of y'all,
which we know there's a lot of y'all,
stick on with us.
Stick on with us. So this week, this is completely like a different topic than what we've ever done before. We've done conspiracy theories, but it's a little bit different because this is really true crime. And we wanted to do something in our state. This isn't very recent, but it could be something that you gotta keep an eye out for because it's recent enough.
Oh,
so what we're going to be discussing today is the Colonial Parkway murders, which Gabby found for us, and I was actually pretty into, pretty interesting. Yeah. It's not something that I think is a typical true crime, possible serial killer situation, but for background information, the Colonial Parkway is in Virginia. It's a 23-mile roadway that links Virginia's historic triangle, which is Jamestown, Yorktown, and Williamsburg. So you have like kind of like a back road, pretty scenic.
Yeah, it's like a scenic route sometimes, but other people sometimes use it, like locals, for like actually getting from Jamestown to Yorktown or whatever.
Right. So it's pretty useful other than a highway, but it's pretty. There's a lot of history and a lot of monuments, and that's why a lot of the, I think, it's not magic, but like why people really
like the
attraction of this case is that it is a very historic area, and it's not great when you have people getting murdered on something that is very historical.
Not super great.
And these murders took place in this 3-year time span. I mean, there's some recent possible cases we'll discuss, but really the bulk of the cases were from 1986 to 1989. And when you talk about the road that has a bunch of historical points, it happened. 2 of them, you can correct me if I'm wrong, happened right in the road, but then the other 2 happened kind of close, like a half hour away. Yeah. So they think this is one of the things that links this case, that it's part of this road or very, very close to this back way. And right now, there's possibly 5 murdered couples, but there could be other individuals or couples that we haven't found, because we will discuss one of the cases we didn't even find the bodies, but people think this is part of that same case. Yeah. So, and by the end of this episode, hopefully you have your own thoughts, and we'll share a few more resources if you really are interested in the case. And hopefully we do it justice, because there's a lot of information out there, but we thought this was pretty
Tried
interesting.
To find something that was like kind of condensed it all, but there is more information, so don't just go off of all of this. Go do your own research.
We can always mess up details, and there's always with these cases, it is an ongoing investigation that's still open. The FBI is still going into it, but
it is considered cold, but they're still
I mean, when you have family members involved,
so
people always try to
try to get it going. But so all the resources and stuff that we used and the additional information will be listed in like the show notes and stuff. So if you're interested, go look at that. And like we said, do your own research if you're super interested in it, and don't just use this podcast as the only source of information.
Really is not. There's a lot. Shouldn't be your main source.
There's a lot more information and more details than we're going to provide here. But anyway, so the first couple, at least first known couple, because like we said, there could be other victims or couples that the authorities just don't know about. But this is the first known couple that kind of kicked off these quote unquote Colonial Parkway murders. So the first known victims were Kathleen Thomas, age 27. She was a graduate of United States Naval Academy, and Rebecca Anndowski, who was 21 and a senior of William and Mary College. It was William and Mary College at the time. Now it's William and Mary, like it's university, whatever.
Which is also really not funny, but like
this was back
this is close to CNU, which is where
this is back in 1986. Yeah, when I picked, I didn't realize that like
it's in your backyard.
Literally, I never went to Colonial Parkway because it was really more far north than
what
CNU.
you needed.
But it is in the historic triangle, which is where I went to school. But anyway, so the first known victims. So the authorities discovered Kathleen and Rebecca on Columbus Day weekend in 1986 inside a white 1980 Honda Civic. The car, along with their bodies, which were in the car, were found at Cheatham Annex Overlook in Williamsburg, Virginia. The car had been doused in diesel fuel, but evidence of the crime was kept intact when diesel failed to ignite. So the person, whoever did this, tried to get rid of
the bodies by burning them.
Yeah, tried to burn, but for whatever reason, it just failed to ignite. So it was just a car doused in diesel. Both women were found with rope burns on their neck and wrist with signs of strangulation. The autopsy was inconclusive and could not determine whether a blade had slashed their throats or if they had been strangled to near decapitation. There were little signs of struggle. Both their purses and money were found inside the car, which ruled out robbery as a motive. And there was no evidence of sexual assault pre or post mortem. The pair were fully clothed and sexually intact. Let's pause here.
There's a lot to unpack. I read a little bit more about this case and what certain people had to say about it, like the investigators, and even this is a really important case because it's the first one, and Thomas's brother is the one who continues to this day
one of the other victims.
Of the family, who is really pushing the authorities and trying to keep everyone updated on the details of the case. But with this one, when you said two things, people don't know because serial killers usually have an MO and it's very different. So they weren't sure if they were strangled and if he was cut or not, because some victims weren't sure about that. And the other interesting part about it was when you think about diesel fuel, apparently the murderer tried to use a match, and you can't light diesel fuel with a match. You need something a little bit more powerful. You can use gas, but he didn't. And so the brother thinks maybe it was a truck worker or an agricultural worker who had access to diesel fuel and thought that I could get rid of the evidence this way. So, and also when he realized he couldn't burn the car, he pushed it over the ledge and thought it would sink into the river. But it got stuck in like underbrush area. So the car didn't go all the way, but you couldn't really see it visually from the road. So that's why it was found later. So just interesting, because obviously I think a pattern that I started to see with the cases is that the evidence was either better gotten rid of and more well done in a sense, because this is compared to other cases kind of sloppy. He didn't burn the victims. It was, so I don't know. It's kind of,
and it's also weird because they're like a common thread throughout all of the rest of the couples, because it's usually, I don't think they have an individual person that they know of
I didn't find that
was
either.
Killed. It was always not necessarily couples,
at least a pair,
as in romantic, but like just pairs a pair of people, which is super interesting as well. But they never could find like a clear motive with really any of the couples that they discovered their bodies. So even with this first case, like their money and their purses and whatever credit cards or whatever they had were still there, and they were fully clothed, and there was no sexual assault that was clear that took place. It was just, they were just well, they don't know if strangled, or because it was hard to tell because of, I think, the decomposition, if it was strangling that had caused
the death,
decapitation, or if it was a knife.
Yes, that's what I meant to say.
Yeah,
they weren't sure which
they're just not sure. But it just seems like they were killed for like literally no reason. Like money was still there, they weren't raped, just kind of odd. And so I think that really contributes to also like the cold case nature of this of this case, because it's like it's kind of hard to pinpoint suspects when you don't really have a clear motive. But anyway, those are my thoughts.
Because they had the purses in the car, all the money, nothing was taken. It was just like
someone had literally just killed
someone
and then walked away.
And a good note to add, I think, at this point is that whoever the murderer was, people think knew the Colonial Parkway well. To know where, because a lot of these murders took place at night in areas that I guess he or she knew there wouldn't be a lot of people in the road at that time, or located in places that aren't easily visible. So that's the only part that I'm like, obviously the person was aware of their surroundings.
Yeah, definitely like not somebody, because a lot of times I think you have murders on highways or thoroughfares that somebody is passing through and they're not super familiar with it, with the area, because they're just like, I don't know, like transient type of person, or they're a trucker. And so they don't stay around long. But these murders seem to be like a local, like someone from the historic Triangle area,
Right.
or Virginia Beach or something, because it is a roadway that, like, because it's so historic, it does wind, and it winds very long because it connects from Williamsburg all the way to the shore at Yorktown. So it is super like long and winding, and it goes through
Up
trees
and down,
and it goes,
and you have
so you have to be pretty familiar with it to like
know
understand
where you would
you're at.
stop someone or whatever it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that was the first case.
Yeah.
Really sad. People found it and people thought, okay, that's it. But now we have our second couple. This took place on September 20th, 1987. So a little under a year, if I'm correct. And it was David Knobling, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who was 20 years old, and Robin Edwards. She was 14. And they were shot at point blank range in the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, which is near the south shore of James River in Smithfield, Virginia. And their bodies were uncovered after a 3-day search party. The couple, investigators think that they might have been romantically involved. A few key facts that lead up to that is that David's black Ford Ranger pickup truck was discovered with the side window rolled down. And that's a big tip because this is something that is found in other cases. And investigators thought whether the killer had ties to law enforcement or was posing as a police officer. For example, he stopped this couple. The couple rolled their window down and they tried to, that's when the murder happened. And once again, there was no signs of sexual assault or robbery. So this was a little under a year, and it's a very similar case. But once again, I think something about this case that was also interesting, because you think they're couples, and another language that was being used throughout these investigations, that they're happening in lovers' lanes.
Yes. So people would, maybe they were thinking possibly pulling over
to
do
like,
whatever. And that's when they got caught
or
whatever. And so that's why a lot of people think that maybe the person that was doing this was either posing as an officer. So, you know, because usually when a police officer walks up to your car,
you have to roll down the window.
Roll down the window, and you might, you know, you're usually going to do whatever they tell you because you don't want any trouble. You don't want, so if they say roll down your window, step out of the car, you're going to get out of the car because you don't want to not obey a police officer. So I think that's why there is a theory running through all of these cases that the person could possibly have been posing as an officer, maybe
or wanting to be like an authority figure. Yeah.
Or had like some type of badge or some type of uniform, which also made people think it ties in with what we were talking about earlier about it being a local person. And maybe the person worked for the park because part of the Colonial Parkway is maintained by the National Park Service. So maybe they had a uniform that, you know, made them an authority figure, like, hey, I'm National Park Service and you get out of the car, you know, kind of thing. So yeah, but no signs of sexual assault or robbery on that one either, which is interesting because once again, there's no motive. Yeah,
and there's a lot of things different. For example, they were shot at point blank, but it made it seem like they were running away at the time. So they're kind of shot in the back of their heads, execution style. And I think David had one off the shoulder as well. So that's also what makes it seem like he was running away.
Yeah.
So either there was an altercation and they tried to get away. Yeah. So I don't know if that's what led to the different style of murder, because some people think it's not connected. Did go to plan. And that's why. Or if it was purposefully done execution style in the back of the head. And that's why.
Because that's the other thing is usually if you have somebody who is a serial killer, they usually have a certain way of killing. And this obviously is completely different from the first couple who were either strangled or their throats were cut, and then this couple who were shot
with a gun,
which is completely different.
Right.
Yeah.
And once again, even though these are couples, sometimes they're just pairs of people, but these were on their first date. So I'm like, it's also not something that the killer, when you think about that, knew ahead of time. Like if he wanted to kill some people who were romantically involved, I'm like, it's just a pair of people.
So you would really. So it's more of like
I see two people in a car.
A crime of opportunity.
Than anything
else.
that's premeditated.
Yeah.
Because when you try to draw comparisons on the victims, there really is no race,
There's
gender.
nothing in common except it's two people.
Two people.
I mean, I guess you could argue that it might be premeditated because these happened so similarly in the way that it's two people kind of on a back road or back stretch of Colonial Parkway. So I guess you could argue it's premeditated. Like, did the person lie in wait and wait for a car to come down and pull over? Or is it really a crime of opportunity where he's driving down one road and he passes someone who, those two people, and like pulls over and somehow gets them to pull over as well? I don't really know. That's why it's cold case. But the third couple, so on April 10th, 1988, two students from Christopher Newport University, which shout out to my university there,
Terrible.
were reported missing after attending a party in Newport News during their first date together. Their names were Cassandra Lee Haley, she was 18, and Richard Keith Cowell, who was 20. And the discovery of Cowell's red Toyota Celica unoccupied at the York River overlook. And that's where they found the car. The third couple's link to the Parkway murders is somewhat debatable because no bodies have ever been uncovered. They are both presumed to be dead. Evidence points to the same person responsible for the other killings. Still, some investigators are on the fence and don't want to definitely classify their disappearance as part of these murders. So this one's super interesting to me because I think disappearances they just really bother me because I just don't understand how people, especially multiple people, can go missing and you just don't
never find
them. Like, that to me like bothers me.
You.
And it's just like, I think disappearance cases are so interesting, but this is also really interesting because once again, I guess there are a few things in common once you kind of look at all these cases together. Another thing in common, I suppose, would be the age range. So like these are all kids who were
really young,
who were super young, like young adults.
Yeah.
It's not like it's like a 50-year-old guy and a 52-year-old woman. Like, these are all like around college age, or they are college age. Yeah. The youngest, I think, is the 14-year-old in the last case, Robin. But she was with someone who was 20 years old. Yeah. So it's just really interesting how they're all young. Unfortunately, Cassandra and Richard have never been found. But considering the truck was found and they weren't in it, they just kind of assumed that they're probably dead.
Is this the one? Because they found all of their clothes in the truck, though. I think. Is this
the one?
I'm pretty sure because, yes, the one that they didn't end up finding the bodies, but it's right by the river. So you're right. And that's why some investigators think these may not be entirely linked because for all the other cases, the bodies were found. But when it happens with the same kind of pair of people in the same place, it's like the same timeline. And I'm sure once again, like, this is just like a brief overview. Like, these cases are astronomically, like, there's so much detail. If you go on other websites and find, I'm sure it would tell you like exactly where on the Colonial Parkway the truck was found in relation to like the other two previous couples and like where they were found, so you can kind of like map out where each couple was found. But yeah, so I don't know. I think this one, I would feel like it's debatable if it wasn't for like, if it was related to the Colonial Parkway murders, if it wasn't for the fact that it was two young people, like two college age students on the Colonial Parkway. I don't know. I just feel like that is too convenient for it to be somebody else. And it was a couple. It wasn't like one person that went missing. It was two people who went missing like the previous cases. Right. Two young people like the previous cases. And unlike the one that we just had discussed, which was like 30 minutes away, this one was like 2 miles. Like, it was from where the original one, like in the exact same area. Yeah. So I understand why it would be debated. Like, it's always hard to, when you have a case where you don't find bodies, it's always hard to be like, oh, they're definitely dead, because you never know. Like, stranger things have happened where people turn up, ran away, or something happened, or or it was something. It was an accident, especially when you're on like back roads and stuff. And there is the James River that runs right there, and the James River goes on forever. Like, it was right by CNU, and we used to go to the James River all the time, but it goes all the way down. So like, you know, things have happened where there's an accident or whatever. So, but I don't know. I just think it's too convenient to not be connected to the Parkway murders, but that's just my opinion. Always on the side of the question. But I'm actually curious. I forgot. I wanted to look in and see if someone had ever investigated like the actual river. Like, if they had drowned.
Drained it. Yeah,
Because I
don't
never,
know,
when I was
'cause-
reading on these cases, no one, unless they didn't think it was pertinent, but like tried to review like someone go down there with a scuba tank or whatever and see if they see any bodies.
Well, because the James River is pretty, it's not like a tumultuous, like rushing river, but it is pretty long. It's not, I don't think it's not man-made, so draining it would be like not super.
No.
That's easier to do with like a lake, but I don't know if anyone if they ever did an investigation or they had a dive team go down and look for bodies. I feel like maybe depending on
because
where,
in the other one where they did find him, I think the dad of David was the one who headed the search party, and they looked in the forest.
Well, considering this, their car for this third couple from CNU, their car was found at the York River Overlook. I don't know. I feel like it would be like worth investigating the river. I don't know if they ever did, just because like it is on like an overpass and you're right above a river, so you might want to like go look down there. But but it's kind of strange. But then at the other point, it's kind of strange that like both of them would be gone. Like that makes, if it was like one person, but the fact that like, I mean, what's the likelihood of both drowning? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I know. Or again, it just depends. That's why it's so inconsistent.
Yeah.
And this one, I think out of all of them is
the most
interesting or what happened, because all the other bodies have been found. Even we're about to discuss the fourth one, which is they were found, but not in the best condition. No. So a year and a half later, two more young people, once again, I guess that's the only connection between all of them.
Connection is
a pair of young people. Went missing near the Colonial Parkway on Memorial Day weekend. 1989, Daniel Lauer, who was 21, was driving to his brother's house in Virginia Beach with his brother's girlfriend, called Anna Maria Phelps. So they're not really a couple.
No, they're just together driving.
She was driving his brother's girlfriend, who was 18. So on September 5th, they were reported missing when their car was found abandoned at the New Kent rest stop on I-64. The car was found on the westbound side of the highway, the opposite direction of the destination, which is really interesting because that confused police, and I think they thought the car was moved. Like the two were removed, and I guess the killer moved the car to be pointing the opposite direction. It is unclear whether Anna Marie and David pulled over and were killed at the rest stop, or if they were killed elsewhere and the killer moved their car. Her purse was found inside the car, once again ruling robbery out as a motive, and their bodies were found over a month later on October 19th by hunters on a logging road about a mile away from that rest stop that the car was found in. The bodies were covered in a blanket from Daniel's car and were badly decomposed because of the rain, and the blanket made it even more humid, so decomposing went so much faster. And it made it really hard to determine what was the cause of death or if there'd been sexual assault. And even though the cause of death could not be determined, there appeared to be stab marks on her bones, but that's the only thing that suggested how they could have died, but nothing on his body. So this one, again, when you think about the previous case, the bodies disappearing, like what if they just never were found?
Well, that's what's interesting. I feel like
it's so hard to look with such a densely forested area, and you have rivers on all sides. I'm like, it would be impossible to have a search party to really comb through everything. And I mean, this was just a month later, and the way the bodies were hidden under a blanket, the decomposed, like you have no hope of finding actual remains.
And I feel like the first two couples are more connected, and then like the last two are more connected, even though there's no bodies for the third couple. I kind of had a thought, like, even though the third couple, like their bodies were not found, but the car was found over the York River overlook. I mean, who's to say that's the same deal that the fourth couple, their car, I feel like they were probably murdered somewhere else, and the killer moved their car, because the blanket that their bodies were covered in was from his car. So he was obviously in there rifling around looking for things to cover the bodies with. So who's to say that he didn't move the car over the York River overlook for the third couple? Like,
you just don't know.
He has access. I mean, his keys, obviously. So maybe the third couple, he buried them. If they're at Yorktown, maybe he buried them all the way in freaking Williamsburg. Yeah. And he just dropped the car at the York River overlook. So, I mean, if you have a car,
which makes
then
it
you
that
have access to
anything. You can go anywhere.
So,
and it just makes it difficult because then it's hard for investigators to place the murder where they're murdered and where the car ends up are
two completely
different locations. So it, yeah, very premeditated. Like he obviously knows where he wants to place the body separate from the car. And when you think about the first one, that's what I mean by sloppy. I'm like, he thought the
bodies were in the car.
He tried to burn them.
Obviously, that didn't work out for him.
He or she tried to burn them, and then he just pushed it over the ledge, and that's a done deal. But with these other ones, it's like it gets a little bit more involved and a little bit harder to actually investigate what's going on. Yeah. So,
and the fact that once again there was it's hard with this last case to know if there was sexual assault because the bodies were so badly decomposed. But considering the last three didn't have
robbery.
Sexual assault and robbery, hard pressed to think that maybe he had suddenly felt like sexually assaulting somebody with like the fourth case. So it's kind of hard to determine that as well. Like, once again, no motive. Why is this person, like, what are they gaining from this? There's usually sexual assault or robbery, maybe, but like,
or like a specific type of victim that they're looking for. Right. Yeah. But here, and I mean, I thought it was so sad in this case because obviously they're driving over to their family's house to bring, the girlfriend. And I'm like, they never arrived.
No. Yeah.
And it's like, when you have that big question of like what ended up happening. I don't know. I just thought it was so sad because in this one, I'm just like, it ended up facing the opposite direction. I'm like, he really going. Yeah. I don't know. It's like those little details that you're like, was that intentional? Is that just in the heat of the moment? He didn't know what to do and it ended up facing the opposite direction. Yeah. But is it supposed to mean something? You never know when they're trying to leave clues or be smart about something. So I don't.
Yeah. These are all really sad because it's like, I mean, like we said, like it's two people for every case. So it's not like just, I mean, one person's obviously bad enough, but to have like two families suffering for every single time. But so that's the last couple that they really feel like is that they're really, even though the third couple, their bodies were never found. The four couples that we just went over, those are the ones that investigators mainly assume are all connected by the same person. But there is a possible fifth couple that happened 7 years after the fourth couple was found murdered. So that's why they're
But not a lot of people think this one might be connected.
Maybe. Considering it happened 7 years later, because after the fourth couple, the killings abruptly stopped. Which sometimes could be because the person who was doing the killing moved. Could be as simple as that. They died. They had their fill. I mean, I don't know.
Although it's true though, because in some cases you have serial killers who like get what they want and they're satisfied. And then 7 years later, they're like,
it's something like a fix. Like, and it sounds really horrible, but like, it's the same with like, I don't want to compare it to alcohol because it's not like that. But like, you can be 7 years sober and then all of a sudden for some reason, something happens in your life that's stressful and you're right back drinking
the same
at 11 a.m. Horrendous. So like, it's kind of like that. But, or they got picked up for another crime. They could have gotten arrested for something petty,
just something that a lot of people thought. A lot of people thought he was the suspect, he or she was put to prison for something else unrelated. For something
completely unrelated.
And you never know.
It could have been like some weird, like, I don't know, petty theft or something that he was in jail for 7 years and then he's out on parole and he's starting to kill again. But considering this case, the fifth couple that I'm about to talk about, it happened once and then no other killings really happened again. I'm hard pressed to think that this is related, but 7 years after the final killing, another case reignited this investigation. A couple romantically involved were found bound, gagged, and their throats slit almost 200 miles from the initial hunting ground. Their bodies uncovered in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park, and their names were Julia Williams, who was 24, and Lolly Winans, who was 26. And it's saying they displayed a wealth of similarities to the Parkway case. I don't really believe that because I don't think there's really any similarities despite it being a couple. But the fact that they were found bound, gagged, and their throats slit, that does not seem like whoever was doing the killings for the other four, except maybe the the first one, where they couldn't tell if their throats had been slit or if they were strangled. But
Right.
this one is like they're bound, gagged, like that had never happened in the other cases. Well, we don't know about the third one because they were never found. But as far as investigators know, they never found any ligature marks on any of the other bodies for the other cases. So it seems kind of like a stretch. Also, they were not found any, like Shenandoah National Park. I mean, we live in Virginia. We know that's nowhere near.
Right.
That's nowhere near the historic triangle.
Right.
It's complete opposite direction. And Shenandoah, once again, Shenandoah, it's a national park. So it is super, not isolated, but it's a national park. It's expansive. If you want to get lost, you totally can. It's scenic. So that's a similarity, but it's a completely different area, I suppose. Like we kind of said, like maybe this person moved and 7 years later they're at Shenandoah. I don't know. It just seems like maybe this could just be a different person, because there are a lot of, this is a completely different thread, but there are a lot of murders that occur in our national parks in the United States. Yeah. Because it's a really easy way to kill someone, especially out west when they're like huge national parks. A lot of people go, like, it's like a whole missing. It's a whole thing, like it's a whole topic in like true crime. Is like talking about national park disappearances in the United States are super common.
You'll never catch me at one.
So you'll never catch me spending the night in a national park. So yeah, I don't know. I just feel like I don't know if this fifth couple.
I mean, it's good to mention it because here's the thing. As much as we might think that fifth couple is not related at all, there's people who think the previous four aren't related, or that they were all separate killers, or 2 and 2. Yeah. For example, I had found that one of the detectives on the case, called Steve Spignola, I want to say the last name right. He was hired as a private investigator for the case, and he thinks that the murders of Kathy and Rebecca are not related to any of the other murders at all. Right. He thinks that it's connected to another double homicide that happened in Shenandoah National Park in 1996, where he thinks like that one is related to the one you just mentioned because they were homosexuals. So he thinks that maybe that's premeditated specifically against that. And it's similar because they were gagged and their throats were slit in the first one. He thinks either
that possibly
it's a similar style of killing and similar couple style. So he thinks those were from the same perpetrator, but then the other two weren't. So I'm not an investigator.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
but there's a lot of theories as to what it could be.
Yeah. And how they're connected. And I mean, that's a good point too, because there was a few investigators who thought maybe they were it was like homophobic murders, but that doesn't
not explain really. Not all of them.
The case where it was, they weren't even romantically involved. It was just driving to see family.
Just a pair of people.
And it was a guy and a girl. So, you know, it's just kind of weird. That's why I think this case has gone so cold, is because when you don't have a motive and there's like no clear motive and there's not even a clear manner of killing, like it's, everyone is kind of different. And sometimes you find bodies and sometimes you don't. Sometimes the bodies are in the car and sometimes they're outside of the car, and sometimes the car is dumped somewhere else, and sometimes they're with the car. Like, you know, you just don't know. So it's kind of hard to come up with any lead when, first of all, these happen so isolated and you really don't have any witnesses. 2, this happened in the 1980s. There's no security cameras like we have now. I don't know. I never went on the Colonial Parkway when I was in college. I knew where it was and people talked about it like, oh yeah, I used the Parkway to get here. And when people said like, I used the Parkway, I just know it's Colonial Parkway.
Right.
But I had no reason to be on it. So I don't know. I'm sure now there's like some type of like security cameras every few miles. I would hope. I don't know, because it is so isolated, and these did happen in the 80s.
And it's a long stretch of road.
It's a very long stretch of road. So
always be careful. I was always careful going on any back way.
Oh yeah, dude. Like 100%.
At night, always be careful.
And there's really no rest stops along the road. Like the road itself is like 23, 24 miles. But there's a lot of back roads off of that, off the Colonial Parkway. So that go into other areas, that go into the woods, that go to bike paths. So I would hope now that they have like more like ranger stations maybe along, because it is maintained by the National Park Service. But this was back in the 80s. So
it's amazing how the buzz, because while they were happening, people were like, oh my gosh, you can't go on the Colonial, Lover's Lane. You're going to get murdered. Yeah. It's spooky because it's historical. And now like, I'd never heard of it, but I'm like, tons of people were murdered there 20 years ago. Yeah. And that killer could still be alive, out and about, doing whatever. So,
hopefully
Wild.
with they do have DNA, but they have no matches, which also is interesting because that kind of not ruins the theory about him possibly being arrested and having a record, because
You would match.
now they have, I think most states, I think it's more of a state law than a federal, but now I think a lot of states are turning to the fact that like, if you're arrested at all, we take your DNA. I think a lot of times states are like, if you're arrested for a federal crime, we take your DNA, and if you're fingerprinted, all of that, you're in the system. But I think a lot of times other states that are more lenient don't do that. So they might take fingerprints, but they don't take DNA. And so I think now states, because DNA has evolved so much, and like the Golden State Killer was, who was murdering back in the 70s, I think, was just arrested 2 years ago. And it was through DNA. So I think states now are like, wow, we need to be taking people's DNA. If you're arrested, we take your DNA. Like, I don't care if you're arrested for freaking like
whatever it
looking
is.
at me weird. Like, we're taking your DNA. So, because you never know how a cold case could be solved. And
that's sad too, because you're relying on current technology has advanced so much, even in 20 years, that if you had that capability 20 years ago, it would have completely changed. I think that's a note that Thomas, the brother, was making, that he's really trying to still keep it not going cold, because he's like, I think the most recent development was that 2 years ago, 3 out of the 4 cases, the ones where the bodies were found, they have a possible like perpetrator DNA. It's not linked, like you said, but that's something.
They have something. And it's also hard when like there's no, like, you can find like hair, skin cells, dirt from under your fingernails, whatever. Like you can find that at a crime scene. But a lot of times with serial killers, like the DNA that they really preserve is after sexual assault, and they find semen, but there's no sexual assault for these. So it's kind of like, you're always going to find skin cells, but you're just kind of like
hard. Like if you're fighting back, you dig into the person's skin or whatever. But
especially with a lot of these bodies, they were really decomposed, so a lot of the DNA is kind of ruined. But they haven't found a match. So hopefully, I mean, I think when it comes to cases like these, I thought a lot of times investigators and cold case investigators just wait for the person to slip up and commit a crime, which sucks that you have to wait for them to like commit a crime and get caught in order to find out who but I mean, like, that's not always the case more, because DNA has evolved so much. So hopefully like with the Golden State Killer, the way they found him was through like, I don't know, it was like some distant family member that they got DNA from, and they were able to trace it back using like ancestry.com or something to find out that like he was related to the DNA that they had found on all these women's bodies. So back in California. So like,
I mean, that's a really interesting point that you said, like, whoever is doing these murders, they kind of have to mess up for us to find them. Yeah. Which is kind of horrific. It reminds me of a quote I read from one of the investigators talking about it, which he said, there has to be a degree of self-sabotage from a serial killer for an investigation to pan out. If they're smart enough to not get caught, there's very little we can do.
Right.
Which I'm just like, wow, okay.
Yeah. Which is really wild.
Like, I mean, you've had 8 people go missing.
At least.
Which once one happens, you would think, I mean, it's just a long stretch of road. We're going to pump up security, understand what's going on. And you really can't. You need to put that upon yourself.
Yeah, you can't really do.
I'm not blaming anyone,
but it's kind of like, well, that's the thing. It's just kind of like you're at a loss.
They know that if you don't mess up, and that's why it's so different. Because like I said, it's not even that it was very well done in a sense. It's just
an isolated area.
It's an isolated area.
Really it. Yeah.
That's really all that it is.
And you have, I mean, obviously this person at some point had a gun if the cases are all connected, because he shot, I think it was the second couple were found shot. So, and once again, that's why I'm just kind of convinced like this person must have either worked for the National Park Service, was posing as a police officer, somehow had access to a badge or a uniform that made them look official and made you want to trust them, that made you roll your window down, get out of your car, whatever. I mean, because if a random person with no badge, no uniform walked up to my car and was like, roll your window down, I'd be like, heck no. Yeah. Like, you can't tell me that all these couples were like, okay.
And my mom, dude, in Puerto Rico, you have people late at night on those roads, and mom's like, you follow them until you get to a police station. Like, there's things that, like, for your own safety, you should put nothing else at risk for your own safety.
Well, even here, like, I mean, that's what, like, my parents, when I started driving, they were like, I don't care if it's a cop and he has a badge or she has a badge and a uniform and is in a police car. like if they pull you over, tell them like, can we please go to like a more well-lit area?
Yes.
Can we go to a residential area where I'm in front of a house? Like, can we go somewhere, like you pulling me over on the side of the road? And they're like, if it's a cop that hopefully understand that they won't have a problem following you or you following them to like a more well-lit area, especially with undercover cops and stuff. Like you don't know.
Hard,
like you just, yeah, but if these people, that's why it's like more of a crime of opportunity, maybe because they're already on a stretch of road that's super isolated with tons of tree coverage, not tons of people around. Possibly at night. I don't know. And that's the other thing. We don't know when these murders happened. Was it during the day?
They were
was
thinking,
it at night?
I mean, a lot of them apparently happened supposedly at night.
But if you find the body, 3 days later, then it's like, well, then we don't know when this happened. I mean, you can pinpoint a day and maybe a time, but usually, especially back in the 80s, they were probably like decomposition's like 3 days. So like, but is it 3 days ago at 2 a.m. or is it 3 days ago at 3 p.m.? Like, when did this occur? Like, we don't know. So and
to this day,
fine. So
there's really no suspects. There was one that I'll mention because he's very, very a name mentioned in the case, which is Fred Atwell, who was a Virginia deputy, who the reason his name was like put around in circles is that he was accused of robbing a woman in Roanoke County at gunpoint. But that was later on from when this happened. So in 2009, Atwell was considered like a hero when he discovered I think it was 89 photographs regarding these homicides inappropriately taken from the FBI's Norfolk office. And they were found as like part of the security training from some random company. And so he's like some sort of hero. He joins the scene with these families who are trying to get to the bottom of this case. And the family started sharing like weird interactions they were having with him, where he would get super hell-bent on some sort of tip, whatever it was, like, so that someone had called him saying like, oh, I have a possible suspect, but you need to do this for me or give a certain amount of money. And I think eventually the families were like, no, that's weird. It fizzled out. But people thought because of his obsession or certain things he knew about the cases, that even if he wasn't the killer, he knew something. But actually I found out, I think he died 2 years ago.
Oh, did he?
So whatever he knew died with him. Yeah. But so considering he was like that deputy, whether or not that badge, when we were talking about having a police officer. Yeah. So it's also kind of freaky when you have someone who knows, like, he found these photographs, was trying to get money out of the case. Apparently he had been separate from his wife and he was like homeless or looking for money. He was, so I don't know if he was just trying to be opportunistic with the situation and be like, I can get money out of this, or if he really did have something to do with it. So he's known as like the whistleblower of the case, but it's
other than that,
no
other
connection or suspect. Which is sad. The family had to kind of like deal with them, and then he left because he was trying to do phony raffles or whatever it was, and got arrested. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting case overall. I think I don't know. It's just one of those ones that you're like, I can tell why this is some. You know how like sometimes you have cases and there's a suspect and he did it, but they just don't have enough
evidence,
him.
Which is so.
But everybody understands. But with this, it's like could be anybody. And considering this happened back in the 80s, like the further you get away from it, first of all, even if there could be eyewitnesses, but the further you get away from the crimes, then those eyewitnesses are gonna either they don't remember what they saw, they don't know that what they saw was something shifty, they are dead, or whatever. Like, it's just the further you get away from it, the more the less of a chance of it being solved. And that's I mean, everybody knows first 48. Like most, if the case isn't solved within the first 48 hours, it's probably gonna go cold. Not always the case, because like I said, because of DNA, sometimes the further you get away from a case, the chance increases because of DNA of it being solved, and that's great.
That's a
slight little of hope. Like I said, like the Golden State Killer, who was like this infamous killer that nobody knew for 40 years, 50 years. Suddenly, he got convicted a few months ago. So I mean, but yeah, it's interesting how this is just, you would think after 8 people at least, there would be somebody to be like, I saw something, or something didn't seem right, or I do remember seeing this, or this person at my workplace was acting really, really weird that day, but there's nothing. So it's just kind of interesting how this case kind of played out, but it's sad, and hopefully the families are
and actually if you are interested in the case, the brother did open a Facebook page, which I checked out, very, very interesting, called, I think, the Colonial Parkway Murders, and they're a community. You can join them, and he actually updates a lot. They have a podcast themselves. I'm sure that's a lot more informative than what these past 45 minutes have been, called Mind Over Murder. And they're all related to these murder cases, about lessons or new updates regarding them. And it's kind of like what you were saying, how it doesn't matter how long, even though it gets more unlikely, people either step up and say, I did these. He recently posted Samuel Little, a serial killer who confessed to 93 murders, passed away at 80. So like, he's like, there's people who, there's still hope. I think he's trying to, for the community, for the families, saying like, the FBI or local authorities, which is also a big part of the case, like depending on who was investigating which murder, he's like, it's all over the place. The information files get messy, but that they could either step up and say, hey, this was me for whatever, pair of people, or that we can actually get to the bottom of it, whether it's by DNA. I don't know.
And sometimes time weighs on people's conscience as well. Like, and people start to feel guilty, or whether it be the person that did it or people who were around the person that did it, and they know more than they, initially said if they talked to police, and then all of a sudden 40 years later they're like, I can't keep this secret anymore, I feel so guilty. So or sometimes, like, a lot of times cases are solved through spiteful ex-girlfriends who they were with the person who was doing these murders at the time, and they were keeping a secret, and then 40 years later they break up or something happens, they get a divorce, and all of a sudden they're like, I'm gonna go to the cops and I'm gonna tell them what you did. And sometimes that it comes like,
or they slip up,
how many confessions or
happen through
case breaks happen through spiteful exes who are like, I'm gonna go to the cops and tell them everything. Like, so you never know. Sometimes the further you get away from stuff time wise, like from a case, like the chance lowers, but also people come out of nowhere and they're like 40 years ago in 1980 whatever, like,
or they get caught for like a petty crime, and they're like, oh yeah, you did it,
and they get their fingerprints or DNA, and all of a sudden there's a match. So
20 years, I mean, actually it's been 25 that it in the big scheme of things, like, there's still hope for the case. And I don't know, it was really interesting. I would have never thought that a few hours away from here there's been like a whole like Virginia conspiracy true crime situation going on.
2 students were from CNU.
I know. It's really close. Again, it's young adults, pairs, whether they were friends, romantically
lovers,
involved, whatever they were. Like, if you're driving in any back way, remember this and be careful. Don't stop for no one. I tell you this, my mom has always told me, like, if it's late at night and there ain't nobody else around, you follow yourself all the way out to some sort of police station, somewhere with more people. Because you can't trust people.
No, you cannot.
You don't know. Obviously, these
so hopefully this brings like a little bit of, it's a little different episode we don't usually do, but it was fun to do and
interesting. Hopefully not too scary.
Yeah. So, and like we said, like, check out, we'll link everything in like the show notes and stuff, but check out the Facebook page that the brother of one of the victims is running and keeping up to date with their podcast.
They have their own podcast.
So all of that. And if you do go over there, be respectful. If you comment or want to get involved, because these are people who lost their lives for no reason at all. And their families are obviously still suffering. So be respectful. And that's all we got.
A little interesting, a little different. We'll be back to our usual program.
Usual stuff.
Next week.
Your usual programming will be back.
But this is informative. And I think it was kind of like important too.
Yeah.
So
cool. On that note,
we'll end it positively. Be safe, be respectful.
Yep.
And check out the other resources, really do, because we are not the end all be all for this. Like, there's so much more information. Whether
this was
it's
a brief overview. It sounded like a lot of information, but there's
trust
so much
me.
more. So
whatever, always double check your sources, but we'll link.
Draw your own conclusions and have a time thinking through it, but always maintain that there's tons more detail out there than any of us know, because I'm sure investigators aren't saying everything they know. But Cool.
For sure.
All right.
But-
Well, we'll see you guys next week for our regularly scheduled programming. Bye.
Bye.